Peace, Candle, Death. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Alice, your host, and I'm so glad to have you with us again. Tonight, I'd love to ask you something. What is it that makes you enjoy these cozy mysteries? Share your reason in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Peace Vigil. At 9. The November evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular chill that spoke of winter's approach, and the ancient stones of St. Michael's seemed to absorb the dampness from the air. Miss Jane Marple pulled her knitted shawl more closely about her shoulders as she made her way up the church path, her sensible shoes clicking softly against the worn flagstones that had been trodden by countless parishioners over the centuries. The parish flyers had been most enthusiastic about tonight's event, she reflected. Peace and Reconciliation Hour by candlelight, they had proclaimed in bold letters, with smaller text explaining that the St. Mary Mead Peace League would be holding a special vigil to commemorate those lost in the recent war and to pray for lasting peace in the world. Miss Marple had noticed that the flyers bore the neat typing of Miss Edna Vale, the village librarian, whose precise nature extended to all her volunteer work. As she approached the heavy oak doors, Miss Marple observed the small gathering of villagers making their way into the church. The November darkness had fallen early, and the warm glow spilling from the church windows created pools of golden light on the gravel path. "Good evening, Miss Marple," came a cultured voice beside her. She turned to see Alden Rowe, the Peace League's treasurer, a man of middle years whose urbane manner and well-tailored coat spoke of comfortable circumstances. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and he carried himself with the confidence of one accustomed to being listened to in committee meetings and parish gatherings. "Good evening, Mr. Rowe," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "How thoughtful of the Peace League to organize such a meaningful event." "Indeed," Rowe smiled, though Miss Marple detected something slightly strained about his expression. "Mrs. Pritchard has been most energetic in her arrangements. She's brought a special candle from her own collection for tonight's vigil." He paused, glancing toward the church entrance. "I do hope the evening proceeds smoothly. There are certain matters that require, clarification among our little group." Before Miss Marple could inquire what he meant, they were joined by Lionel Keene, the church warden, a brisk man in his 40s whose efficiency in church matters was legendary. He was carrying what appeared to be a decorator's tray filled with various tools and polishing cloths. "Evening, Miss Marple, Mr. Rowe," Keene said with characteristic energy. "Just putting the finishing touches on the arrangements. Can't have things looking less than perfect for such an important occasion." He hefted his tray slightly. "Been giving some of the brass a proper polish this afternoon. Nothing worse than tarnished fixtures during a solemn ceremony." "Most conscientious of you, Mr. Keene," Miss Marple observed, noting the man's slightly flushed appearance and the faint chemical scent of metal polish that clung to his clothes. As they entered the church together, Miss Marple was struck by the transformed atmosphere within. The nave was dimly lit, creating an atmosphere of reverent contemplation, quite different from the usual bright Sunday morning services. At the far end near the Lady Chapel, a single candle burned within a glass hurricane shade, casting dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. Mrs. Honor Pritchard, the Peace League's chairwoman, was fussing over this central candle with the devoted attention of one tending a sacred flame. A handsome woman in her 50s, she carried herself with the dignity of her widowhood, her black coat and hat speaking of perpetual mourning for her husband lost in the war. The candle she had brought was clearly something special. A thick pillar of what appeared to be pure beeswax with a blue ribbon tied around its base bearing the word "Peace" in silver letters. "Mrs. Pritchard," Miss Marple greeted her warmly. "What a beautiful candle." "Thank you, dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Pritchard replied, her voice carrying the slight breathlessness of one managing important details. It belonged to my late husband's mother. She always said that beeswax candles burned with a purer flame than ordinary paraffin ones. It seemed appropriate for tonight's purpose. Near the petition table that had been set up in the north aisle, Miss Edna Vale was making final adjustments to neat stacks of papers and ensuring that the inkwells were properly filled. The librarian's methodical nature was evident in every precisely aligned document, and her fingers bore the telltale stains of printer's ink from her afternoon's work, preparing materials for the vigil. Mr. Jelks, the verger, appeared from behind the vestry curtains, his usual fussiness even more pronounced than usual. He was moving kneelers and adjusting candlesticks with a proprietary air of one who knew exactly where everything in the church belonged and how it should be positioned. "The pricket stands need to be just so," he was muttering to himself as he worked, 3 paces back from the chapel rail, as they have always been. "Standards must be maintained." Miss Marple noticed Lady Bantry making her way toward the front pews. Her friend Dolly's presence was always a source of comfort in any gathering. Behind her came Inspector Slack, looking rather uncomfortable in the ecclesiastical setting, and Dr. Haydock, whose medical bag suggested he'd come directly from his evening rounds. The Reverend Clement emerged from the vestry, his wife Griselda beside him, both looking appropriately solemn for the occasion. The vicar moved to the chancel steps, his prayer book in hand, while Mrs. Clement took her place in the front pew. As 9 approached, Mr. Keene made a final inspection of the nave, paying particular attention to a runner in the south aisle. "Can't have anyone tripping in the dim light," he explained to no one in particular, adjusting the fabric with careful attention. Miss Marple settled herself in a pew with a clear view of the proceedings, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. The 2 tall pricket stands flanking the Lady Chapel rail stood unlit, their brass surfaces gleaming dully in the candlelight. Something about their positioning struck her as unusual, though she could not immediately place what seemed different. The church clock began to chime 9, its ancient bronze voice calling the faithful to this special observance. Reverend Clement raised his hand for attention, and the small congregation fell silent. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the stone-walled space, "we gather tonight in the spirit of peace and reconciliation, to remember those who have given their lives for peace, and to pray that such sacrifice may not be in vain." The brief opening prayer was delivered with simple dignity, and as the last amen echoed from the rafters, the vicar announced, "We shall now observe 2 minutes of silence in memory of all who have died in service of peace." The silence that fell over St. Michael's was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of fabric as someone shifted position, and the gentle, flickering sound of the solitary peace candle in its hurricane shade. It was in the depth of this sacred quiet that the interruption came, sharp and startling in the reverent atmosphere. A single metallic clank rang out, the sound of metal striking stone somewhere beyond the chancel screen. A moment later, a heavy thud followed, and then an even deeper silence seemed to settle over the church, as if the very building were holding its breath. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle clicking, and she found herself listening with the heightened attention that her years of observing human nature had taught her to trust. Something, she was quite certain, had gone very wrong indeed. Chapter 2. A Fall on the Pricket. The silence that followed those disturbing sounds seemed to stretch for an eternity, though it could not have lasted more than a few seconds. Miss Marple found herself counting her own heartbeats, a habit she had developed during moments of uncertainty, and had reached only 7 when the spell was broken by a woman's sharp intake of breath. "Oh my goodness," came Mrs. Pritchard's voice, tight with concern. "Someone's been taken ill." The Reverend Clement's training in pastoral emergencies served him well. "Lights, please, Mr. Keene," he called out with calm authority. "Dr. Haydock, your assistance may be required." The electric lights blazed suddenly to life, banishing the reverent dimness and revealing the scene with harsh clarity. What they illuminated sent a collective gasp through the small congregation. In the Lady Chapel, beyond the carved wooden screen, Alden Rowe lay sprawled backward in what appeared to be a most uncomfortable position. His body was pressed against one of the tall brass pricket candlesticks, and something was clearly very wrong with the way he was positioned. His head lolled at an unnatural angle, and his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled in a manner that spoke of sudden collapse. Dr. Haydock was already moving with the swift efficiency of a country physician accustomed to emergencies. His footsteps echoed hollowly on the stone flags as he hurried toward the chapel, his medical bag swinging at his side. "Stand back, please, everyone," he called over his shoulder. "Give the man some air." Miss Marple rose quietly from her pew and followed at a respectful distance, her keen eyes taking in details with the thoroughness that had become second nature to her. Lady Bantry appeared at her elbow, her face pale but determined. "Jane," Dolly whispered, "this doesn't look like any ordinary fainting spell." Indeed, it did not. As Dr. Haydock knelt beside the fallen man, the true nature of the situation became apparent. The brass pricket, which should have stood firmly upright, had somehow shifted position. Its heavy base had skidded perhaps an inch across the stone floor, leaving a fresh circular mark on the ancient flagstones. More alarming still, the sharp spike at the top of the stand had penetrated the fabric of Rowe's coat collar, and Miss Marple could see with horrible clarity that it had gone deeper than fabric alone. "Dear God," breathed Inspector Slack, who had pushed forward to assess the situation with professional interest. Despite his frequent clashes with Miss Marple over matters of detection, he was a conscientious officer when faced with genuine crisis. Dr. Haydock worked swiftly but carefully, his experienced hands checking for signs of life while being mindful of the precarious positioning. After what seemed like hours but was surely only minutes, he sat back on his heels with the weary expression of one who had done all that medical skill could accomplish. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced quietly. "The poor fellow appears to have fallen backward onto the pricket. The spike has caused a single fatal puncture wound, though there's some blunt tearing around what seems to be a newly sharpened point." He looked up at the gathered faces with professional gravity. Death would have been very nearly instantaneous. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his official duties overriding his discomfort with the church setting. "A tragic accident, then, Doctor. The gentleman suffered a fainting fit and fell backward onto the candlestick." "That would appear to be the most logical explanation," Dr. Haydock agreed, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied with such a simple conclusion. Mr. Jelks had approached the scene with the proprietorial concern of one responsible for every stick of church furniture. "But, Inspector," he said, his voice trembling with distress, "this is most irregular. The pricket stands are always kept 3 paces back from the chapel rail. Always. I've maintained their positioning for 15 years, and they are never placed so close to where someone might stumble against them." He gestured with shaking hands toward the base of the pricket stand. "Look here, sir. You can see the old mark on the stone where this stand normally rests. This one has been brought forward considerably from its proper position." Miss Marple had been conducting her own quiet examination of the scene, and several details had caught her attention. Moving closer to where Alden Rowe lay, she noticed a faint smudge of soot low on the back of his jacket, a mark that seemed inconsistent with a simple fall in the dimly lit church. But it was another discovery that truly intrigued her. Along the south aisle runner, near where several pew ends created natural shadows, she observed a light dusting of golden crumbs. They were small and had a waxy consistency that caught what light there was, quite different from the usual dust and debris one might expect to find on church carpeting. "Most curious," she murmured to herself. though Lady Bantry's sharp hearing caught the comment. "What is it, Jane? You found something?" Miss Marple straightened slowly, her joints protesting the movement. "Perhaps nothing of significance, my dear. Though I confess I find it rather odd that there should be beeswax crumbs scattered along the runner here, when the church uses only paraffin candles for its ordinary services." She gestured delicately toward the trail of golden particles. "These appear to be the sort of natural wax droppings one gets from a pure beeswax candle, quite different from the brittle white flakes that paraffin leaves behind." Mrs. Pritchard, who had been standing in shocked silence near her beloved peace candle, overheard this observation. "Oh, but Miss Marple, my candle is made of beeswax. I mentioned that to you earlier this evening. It was my late mother-in-law's, and she always insisted that beeswax burned with a cleaner flame." "Quite so, Mrs. Pritchard. But what strikes me as peculiar is that these wax droppings lie nowhere near your beautiful candle. They seem to follow a path along this side aisle, almost as if something waxy had been drawn along the floor at a rather low level." She paused, examining a pew-end spindle with the thoroughness of one accustomed to noticing details that others might overlook. "And here, I believe, is a faint, greasy line at approximately ankle height." Lady Bantry followed her friend's gaze and saw indeed that there was a subtle mark on the carved wooden spindle, as if something waxy had been drawn across it. "Jane," she said quietly, "what are you thinking?" Miss Marple's blue eyes held that particular gleam that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as the sign of a mind working on a puzzle. "I was merely reflecting, my dear Dolly, on how one might cause a person to fall backward unexpectedly. In my experience, the most reliable method is to interfere with their balance at ankle level. A sudden obstacle where none is expected can cause even the most sure-footed individual to topple quite dramatically." Inspector Slack had overheard this exchange and approached with the skeptical expression he typically wore when Miss Marple began, theorizing about what appeared to be straightforward accidents. "Now see here, Miss Marple," he began, but she interrupted gently. "Of course, Inspector, I may be entirely wrong. It's simply that in my limited experience of observing human nature, I have found that when accidents happen in the dark, they often leave traces that tell a rather different story when examined in the light." She glanced once more at the tragic figure of Alden Rowe, still positioned against the brass pricket in his final fatal pose. "Poor Mr. Rowe. He seemed somewhat preoccupied this evening when I encountered him outside the church. He mentioned that there were certain matters requiring clarification among the Peace League members. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening while making notes for his official report, looked up with interest." "Did he? Indeed. I wonder what sort of matters might have been troubling him." "I'm afraid he didn't elaborate," Miss Marple replied, though he did seem to suggest that the evening might not proceed entirely smoothly. Rather prescient, as it turned out. The small group stood in uncomfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the tragedy that had transformed what should have been a peaceful vigil into something far more sinister. The peace candle continued to burn steadily in its hurricane shade, its pure flame casting wavering shadows on the stone walls, as if nothing whatever had happened to disturb the sacred quiet of St. Michael's Church. But Miss Marple continued to study the scene with the patient attention of one who understood that truth, like good knitting, was often found in the careful examination of seemingly insignificant details. And there were, she was becoming increasingly certain, several details here that deserved very careful attention indeed. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Beeswax. The aftermath of discovering poor Mr. Rowe's body had created the sort of subdued commotion that follows any unexpected tragedy. Inspector Slack had taken charge with his usual brisk efficiency, requesting that everyone remain in the church while he made preliminary inquiries. Dr. Haydock busied himself with the necessary medical formalities, and the Reverend Clement attempted to provide pastoral comfort to his shaken parishioners. Miss Marple, however, found herself drawn back to those curious golden crumbs scattered along the south aisle runner. While the others clustered around the Lady Chapel, discussing the shocking turn of events, she made her way quietly to where she had first noticed the waxy particles. Lady Bantry, ever alert to her friend's movements, followed discreetly. "Jane, you're investigating again, aren't you?" "Merely satisfying an old woman's curiosity, my dear," Miss Marple replied mildly, though her attention remained fixed on the evidence before her. She knelt carefully beside the runner, her experienced eyes examining the scattered fragments with the thoroughness of a natural historian studying specimens. "You see, Dolly, these little golden pieces are quite distinctly different from anything one would expect to find in St. Michael's under normal circumstances." She picked up one of the larger crumbs between her finger and thumb, testing its consistency. The church has always used paraffin altar candles for economy's sake. When paraffin wax cools and hardens, it becomes quite brittle and breaks into sharp white flakes that crumble to powder. She held the golden fragment up to catch the light. "But this is beeswax, which remains somewhat tacky even when hardened and has this characteristic warm color. Pure beeswax, I should say, of excellent quality." Lady Bantry examined the trail of crumbs with growing interest. "But Jane, if Mrs. Pritchard's peace candle is made of beeswax, couldn't these have simply dropped from it when she was arranging things earlier?" "An excellent observation, my dear, and precisely what I wondered myself." Miss Marple rose slowly and gestured toward the distant hurricane lamp where Mrs. Pritchard's candle burned steadily. "But you see that candle has remained in its fixed position throughout the evening, well away from this particular area. The trail of beeswax lies along the south aisle by these pews, following a most peculiar pattern." She began walking slowly along the runner, her keen gaze following the scattered evidence. "See how the fragments form almost a line, as if something coated with beeswax had been drawn along the floor. Not dropped from above, which would create a more random distribution, but dragged along at quite a low level." Pausing at a particular pew end, Miss Marple examined the carved wooden spindle more closely. In the electric light, the greasy mark she had noticed earlier was more apparent, a thin, waxy line that ran horizontally across the wood at approximately the height of an adult's ankle. "Most illuminating," she murmured. "One might almost say that someone had deliberately waxed a length of cord or rope to make it move smoothly and then drawn it along this route." Lady Bantry's eyes widened as the implication became clear. "You mean someone might have stretched a tripwire?" "I prefer not to jump to conclusions, my dear, but the evidence does suggest that something was positioned at ankle height along this path." Miss Marple's voice carried that gentle certainty that those who knew her had learned to respect. "And if one wished to cause someone to fall backward unexpectedly, particularly someone walking in dim light and concentrating on maintaining proper dignity during a solemn ceremony, a strategically placed obstacle at ankle level would be remarkably effective." From across the church, Inspector Slack's voice carried clearly as he interviewed the various members of the Peace League. Miss Marple could hear him asking routine questions about the evening's events, but she suspected he was still treating the matter as a tragic accident rather than something more sinister. She continued her careful examination of the area, noting several additional details that reinforced her growing suspicions. Near one of the pew feet, she discovered a tiny fresh nick in the wood, the sort of mark that might be made by a taut line under sudden pressure. The angle and depth suggested considerable force had been applied. "Dolly, would you be so kind as to examine this runner more closely? I believe you may find some interesting markings in the fabric." Lady Bantry knelt beside her friend and peered at the heavy church runner with its traditional pattern of crosses and lilies. After a moment, she gasped softly. "Jane, there are grooves in the fabric, 2 parallel lines as if something had been drawn underneath it repeatedly." "Precisely. And if you follow those grooves," Miss Marple traced the lines with her finger, "they lead toward the chancel screen, where someone positioned near the south door might have had access to draw such lines without being observed during the moment of silence. She straightened and looked thoughtfully toward where Mr. Keene was speaking with Inspector Slack, his decorator's tray still at his side. It occurs to me that anyone planning such an elaborate arrangement would need several things: access to the church beforehand, knowledge of where people would be positioned during the ceremony, and the tools necessary to prepare such a trap. Lady Bantry followed her gaze. The church warden would certainly have all of those things. Indeed, though we must not allow ourselves to make accusations without proper evidence. Miss Marple moved toward the chancel screen, where a slender pole used for lighting high candles leaned against the carved stonework. However, I find it curious that this taper pole, which should be kept in the vestry, is positioned here, where it might serve as a convenient tool for someone needing to reach across the screen. Examining the brass hook at the end of the pole, she noted that while it appeared clean, the wooden shaft bore a faint mark that might have been chalk or powder, as if it had rested against something dusty or been used for purposes other than its intended function. You know, Dolly, in my experience of observing village life, I have found that the most elaborate deceptions often arise from the simplest motives. People will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid embarrassment or exposure, particularly when their reputation in the community is at stake. She glanced back toward where Alden Rowe's body lay, still positioned against the fatal pricket. Mr. Rowe mentioned earlier that there were matters requiring clarification among the Peace League members. I wonder what sort of clarification he had in mind, and whether anyone might have preferred to avoid such discussion. Lady Bantry shuddered slightly. To think that someone could plan such a thing during a peace vigil of all occasions. Human nature, my dear, remains remarkably consistent regardless of the setting. The capacity for self-deception is particularly strong when people convince themselves that their actions serve some greater good. Miss Marple's tone carried the sadness of one who had witnessed too many examples of how ordinary people could rationalize extraordinary cruelty as they spoke. Mrs. Pritchard approached with evident distress. "Oh, Miss Marple, this is all so dreadful. Poor Mr. Rowe was such a conscientious treasurer, always so careful with the League's finances. He'd been working on the accounts only this afternoon, preparing for tonight's meeting." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And was there anything particular about the accounts that concerned him?" Mrs. Pritchard wrung her hands nervously. "Well, he did mention something about wanting to discuss certain expenditures with the committee. He seemed quite determined that everything should be perfectly transparent, especially with the hall repairs and the fundraising we've been doing." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. How admirable of him to be so thorough. I imagine such attention to detail would be most appreciated by all concerned. But even as she spoke reassuringly to Mrs. Pritchard, Miss Marple's mind was working through the implications of what she had observed: the beeswax trail, the grooves in the runner, the position taper pole, and now this suggestion of financial irregularities requiring clarification. It all began to form a pattern that spoke not of accident, but of careful, deliberate planning. Someone in St. Michael's Church that evening had wanted very much to prevent Mr. Rowe from making his intended disclosures, and they had been prepared to commit murder to ensure his silence. Chapter 4. The Pricket Filed Fine. While Inspector Slack continued his methodical questioning of the assembled parishioners, Miss Marple found herself drawn to examine more closely the brass pricket that had proved so tragically fatal to poor Mr. Rowe. Dr. Haydock had completed his preliminary examination and stepped aside to make his notes, allowing her to approach the scene with her characteristic quiet thoroughness. The pricket stand was a handsome piece of church furniture, standing nearly 4 feet in height, with its heavy circular base and tall spike designed to hold large candles during special ceremonies. Like most such pieces in St. Michael's, it bore the patina of age and constant use, its brass surface mellowed by decades of careful polishing. But as Miss Marple bent to examine the spike more closely, she noticed something that made her pause. Along the metal point, barely visible unless one looked with particular attention, were minute scratches and file marks that caught the electric light with tiny glints of freshly exposed brass. "How very interesting," she murmured to herself, producing a small magnifying glass from her handbag, a tool she had found increasingly useful in her various observations of village life. Under magnification, the file marks became unmistakable. They formed a regular pattern around the circumference of the spike, creating a series of tiny ridges and valleys that spoke of recent and deliberate sharpening. Most telling of all, caught in the decorative drip pan just below the spike, was a small accumulation of brass dust and filings, bright yellow against the darker metal of the stand. Lady Bantry, who had been watching her friend's investigation with growing fascination, leaned closer. "Jane, what have you found?" "It appears, my dear, that someone has taken considerable trouble to sharpen this particular pricket to a much finer point than would be customary for church use." Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind already working through the implications. Church prickets are traditionally kept somewhat blunt, both for safety and because they need only hold candles securely, not pierce anything. She gestured toward the brass filings. But this spike has been recently filed to quite a sharp point indeed. One might almost say it had been prepared specifically to penetrate fabric and flesh with minimal resistance. The base of the pricket stand also revealed interesting evidence. While most of its surface bore the expected dulling of everyday handling, one section displayed a fresh crescent of polish that gleamed brightly in the electric light, unmarked by the fine layer of dust that had settled on the rest of the brass. "Someone has given this stand a thorough cleaning today," Miss Marple observed, "though curiously only a portion of it seems to have received such attention." From across the church came the sound of Mr. Keene's voice raised in defensive explanation to Inspector Slack. "I always keep the church brass in proper condition, Inspector. It's part of my responsibilities as church warden. I gave several pieces a good polish this very afternoon, as anyone can tell you." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. How convenient that Mr. Keene should mention his polishing activities. Perhaps we might examine his equipment. They approached the churchwarden's decorator's tray, which he had set down near the south door during the evening's tragic events. The tray contained the usual assortment of cleaning supplies and small tools that a conscientious church officer might require: bottles of brass polish, soft cloths for buffing, and various implements for detailed work. Among these items, Miss Marple's attention was immediately drawn to a brass file of moderate size, its metal surface bearing the telltale residue of recent use. Tiny particles of brass dust clung to its teeth, and the handle showed the slight discoloration that comes from frequent handling. "Most illuminating," she murmured, comparing the file's tooth pattern with her memory of the marks she had observed on the pricket spike. "I believe this file would create exactly the sort of scratches we noticed on the spike." Lady Bantry looked troubled. "But Jane, surely a churchwarden would have legitimate reasons for filing church metalwork if it had become damaged or rough." "Quite true, my dear. However, I took the liberty of speaking with Mr. Jelks earlier, and he was most emphatic about the church's policy regarding pricket points." Miss Marple's voice carried that gentle certainty that indicated she had already verified her suspicions. "He assured me that in his 15 years as verger, no one had ever sharpened a pricket spike, and that they were deliberately kept blunt for safety reasons." She gestured toward the fatal stand. "Yet this one has clearly been filed to a much sharper point than its companion, and quite recently, judging by the brightness of the exposed metal." Mr. Jelks himself approached at that moment, drawn by their conversation. His face was pale with the shock of the evening's events, but his professional pride remained intact. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you suggesting that someone deliberately sharpened one of my prickets? I'm afraid the evidence seems to suggest exactly that, Mr. Jelks. Would you examine this spike and tell me if it appears normal to you? The elderly verger bent to look more closely at the brass point, his experienced eye immediately noting the alterations. Good heavens! This has definitely been filed, and recently, too. See here, the metal is still bright where it's been worked. His voice trembled with indignation. In all my years of service, I have never permitted such tampering with church property. The prickets are kept deliberately blunt because they are safer that way, and there is never any need for a sharp point in proper ecclesiastical usage. He straightened with evident distress. Moreover, Miss Marple, I can tell you with absolute certainty that this morning both pricket stands were positioned in their customary locations, 3 paces back from the chapel rail. I marked their positions myself when I cleaned the Lady Chapel flags yesterday. This one has definitely been moved forward from where it should properly stand. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And when did you last check the positioning of the stands, Mr. Jelks? This afternoon when I was preparing for the vigil. Both were in their proper places then. It was only this evening during the arrangements that anyone would have had opportunity to move them. He paused, his face growing more troubled. I did notice Mr. Keene moving various items about. He said he was ensuring everything looked perfect for the ceremony. Inspector Slack had approached during this conversation, his notebook in hand. What's all this about filed prickets and moved furniture? Mr. Keene has explained that he was simply ensuring the church looked its best for tonight's service. Miss Marple turned to address the inspector with her usual courtesy. Of course, Inspector, and most commendable that would be under normal circumstances. However, I believe you will find that the evidence suggests rather more deliberate preparation than simple tidying would require. She gestured toward the pricket and then to Keene's tool tray. The spike has been recently sharpened using what appears to be this particular file, creating a weapon rather than a simple candle holder. The stand has been moved from its customary safe position to one where someone falling backward might encounter it with fatal results. Inspector Slack frowned, clearly reluctant to accept that what had appeared to be a straightforward accident might be something more sinister. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Marple. What possible motive would anyone have for such elaborate preparation? Inspector, I believe the answer to that question lies in Mr. Rowe's mention of needing to clarify certain matters among the Peace League members. Mrs. Pritchard has already told us that he was particularly concerned about the transparency of their financial arrangements. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but persistent. Perhaps someone preferred that such clarification never take place. She looked meaningfully toward the decorator's tray with its collection of tools and supplies. And perhaps someone with access to the church, knowledge of its routines, and the necessary equipment saw an opportunity to prevent any uncomfortable revelations from coming to light. The implications of her words hung heavy in the church air, as damning as any formal accusation, yet expressed with the gentle reasonableness that made Miss Marple's observations so difficult to dismiss. Chapter 5. White Cord. Under the Runner. The revelation about the deliberately sharpened pricket had created a stir of unease among the assembled group, but Miss Marple was far from finished with her examination of the evidence. While Inspector Slack questioned Mr. Keene more closely about his afternoon activities, she returned her attention to the south aisle runner, where those telltale grooves had suggested something had been drawn beneath the fabric. Lady Bantry, who had developed a keen appreciation for her friend's investigative methods over the years, watched with interest as Miss Marple knelt beside the heavy church runner and began to examine its edges with careful precision. "Dolly, my dear," Miss Marple said quietly, "would you be so kind as to help me lift this corner of the runner? I believe we may find something rather illuminating underneath." Together they carefully raised the edge of the fabric, revealing the stone flagging beneath. At first glance, there appeared to be nothing unusual about the ancient floor, worn smooth by centuries of worshippers' feet. But as Miss Marple's experienced eyes searched the area where the grooves had been most apparent, Lady Bantry gasped softly. "Jane, there's something tucked against the skirting board." Indeed, there was. Pressed into the narrow gap between the stone floor and the wooden baseboard was what appeared to be a short length of white cord, its surface smooth and waxy to the touch. Miss Marple extracted it carefully, noting how it had been cut cleanly at one end, while the other showed signs of having been under considerable tension. "Sash cord, I should say," she observed, testing its flexibility between her fingers. "Of good quality and recently waxed to allow it to move smoothly across surfaces." She held it up to the light, where its waxy coating gleamed with that familiar golden sheen they had observed in the scattered crumbs along the runner. Lady Bantry examined the cord with growing excitement. "It's been treated with beeswax, hasn't it? The same sort that Mrs. Pritchard's candle is made from." "Precisely, my dear, and see how smoothly it has been prepared," Miss Marple demonstrated by drawing the cord through her fingers. "Someone has taken considerable care to ensure this would slide silently and easily across fabric and wood." Returning to their examination of the runner, they discovered additional evidence of the cord's former presence. The fabric bore two distinct parallel grooves where lines had been drawn repeatedly beneath it, creating channels that would have guided the cord's movement while keeping it hidden from casual observation. But perhaps most revealing of all was a small nick they discovered in the foot of a nearby pew, a fresh gouge in the old wood that matched perfectly with the diameter of their discovered cord. "You see, Dolly, how the wood has been marked here." Miss Marple indicated the tiny damage. "This suggests that considerable force was applied to a cord passed around this pew foot, enough to bite into the wood when tension was suddenly applied." She stood slowly, her mind clearly working through the mechanics of what they had uncovered. If one were to arrange a loop of waxed cord at ankle height, leading the ends under this runner and back toward the chancel screen, it would be quite possible for someone positioned near the south door to cause an unexpected fall with a simple tug at the crucial moment. As if to confirm her theory, they discovered near the chancel screen additional evidence that someone had indeed been manipulating objects from that position. The slender taper pole that was normally kept in the vestry had clearly been used for purposes other than lighting candles. Its hook end, while apparently clean, bore minute traces of white fiber that matched the texture of their discovered cord. More intriguingly, the wooden shaft of the pole showed a faint chalk mark where it had apparently rested against one of the pew ends, positioned to provide leverage for someone reaching across the screen to manipulate lines hidden beneath the runner. "Most ingenious," Miss Marple murmured, examining these traces with her magnifying glass. The taper pole would have provided exactly the reach necessary for someone to guide the cord into position and then draw it tight at the appropriate moment. Lady Bantry looked toward the Lady Chapel where poor Mr. Rowe's body still lay in its tragic position. "But Jane, this suggests such elaborate planning. Someone must have spent considerable time preparing this trap." "Indeed, my dear, and someone with intimate knowledge of the church's layout, the evening's arrangements, and the positioning of the participants during the ceremony." Miss Marple's voice carried that gentle certainty that indicated her mind had already begun to organize the evidence into a coherent pattern. Moreover, someone who had access to the necessary materials and tools, and the opportunity to make these preparations without observation. From across the nave came the sound of Mr. Keene's increasingly agitated voice as Inspector Slack pressed him about his activities during the afternoon. "I have already explained, Inspector, that I spent considerable time ensuring everything was perfect for tonight's vigil. Moving stands, adjusting runners, polishing brass, all perfectly normal preparation for an important ceremony." Miss Marple and Lady Bantry exchanged meaningful glances. The church warden's own words seemed to provide confirmation of exactly the sort of extensive preparation their discovery suggested. "You know, Dolly," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "in my experience of village life, I've noticed that people often reveal the truth about their activities, even when they believe they are concealing it. Mr. Keene has freely admitted to moving furniture, adjusting the very runner we've been examining, and working with brass and polishing materials throughout the afternoon." She paused to examine the cut end of the cord more closely. "This has been severed with a very sharp blade, cleanly and recently. I wonder if Mr. Keene's tool collection includes such an implement." As if summoned by her words, Inspector Slack approached with Mr. Keene in tow. The churchwarden's face flushed with the strain of repeated questioning. "Miss Marple," the inspector said with barely concealed irritation, "Mr. Keene has been most cooperative in explaining his preparations for tonight's service. I see no reason to suspect anything more sinister than tragic accident." "Of course not, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I wonder if Mr. Keene might help us understand this interesting piece of evidence we've discovered." She held up the length of waxed cord, noting how the churchwarden's eyes widened slightly at the sight of it. "We found this tucked beneath the runner, along with clear signs that similar lines had been drawn back and forth under the fabric. Most curious, wouldn't you agree?" Mr. Keene's face had grown noticeably paler, but his voice remained steady as he replied, "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that, Miss Marple. Perhaps it's some old piece of church property that's been there for years." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though the wax coating appears quite fresh, and the cut end suggests recent preparation." She glanced toward his decorator's tray. "I don't suppose you might have a sharp knife among your tools that could produce such a clean cut?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, politely phrased but unmistakably direct in its implications. Around them, the other members of the peace vigil watched with growing tension as the web of evidence slowly tightened around the man they had trusted with the care of their beloved church. Chapter 6. A Candle Drip on the Wrong. Irene. The discovery of the waxed cord had created an atmosphere of palpable tension within the ancient walls of St. Michael's. Inspector Slack, while still reluctant to abandon his theory of accidental death, was beginning to show signs of professional unease at the accumulation of suspicious evidence. Miss Marple, however, was not yet satisfied with her examination of the scene. Her attention had been drawn to Mrs. Pritchard's beautiful peace candle, still burning steadily in its glass hurricane shade near the altar. Something about its appearance troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what seemed amiss. "Mrs. Pritchard," she called gently, "might I examine your lovely candle more closely? I'm most curious about its construction." The Peace League chairwoman hurried forward, still visibly shaken by the evening's tragic events. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I can't imagine what you might find significant about poor mother-in-law's old candle." As Miss Marple approached the hurricane shade, the source of her unease became apparent. On the glass surface, she observed a hardened drip of wax that had formed on what should have been the protected side of the candle, the side facing away from any natural air movement within the church. "How very peculiar," she murmured, studying the formation with her characteristic thoroughness. "This drip has formed on the windward side of the glass, which seems most unusual for an indoor setting, where there should be no significant air current." Lady Bantry joined her examination. "What does that signify, Jane?" "Well, my dear, when a candle burns in still air, any wax drips typically form on the lee side, away from even the slightest movement of air. But this formation suggests the candle was either moved while lit or exposed to an unusual air current." Miss Marple's voice carried that note of quiet discovery that those who knew her had learned to recognize. She bent closer to examine the blue ribbon tied around the base of the candle. the one bearing the silver word peace in elegant letters. Here, too, something seemed distinctly wrong. Clinging to the fabric was a tiny speck of what appeared to be metal polish, its sharp chemical scent quite distinct from the sweet smell of beeswax or the musty atmosphere of the old church. "Mrs. Pritchard, when did you last handle this ribbon?" The scent suggests contact with brass polish of some kind. Mrs. Pritchard looked bewildered. "Why, I haven't touched the ribbon at all this evening, Miss Marple. I tied it on this afternoon when I was preparing the candle at home, and I've been most careful not to disturb it since bringing it to the church." Miss Marple examined the ribbon more closely, noting that one end appeared to have been cut recently, the fibers clean and sharp rather than frayed with age. The cut appears quite fresh, made with a very sharp blade. From across the church, she could hear Mr. Jelk speaking emphatically to Inspector Slack about the positioning of church furniture. "I tell you, Inspector, those pricket stands were exactly 3 paces back from the chapel rail when I left this afternoon. I've maintained their positions for 15 years, and I mark the spots myself when I clean the flags." His voice carried the indignation of a man whose professional competence had been questioned. "You can see the old ring marks on the stone where they properly belong. This one that killed poor Mr. Rowe has been moved forward by at least 18 inches from where it should stand." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the pricket stands, then back at the peace candle. "Most illuminating, Mr. Jelks. And you're quite certain about the original positioning?" "Absolutely certain, miss. I've kept those stands in their proper places since I first took up my duties here. They're positioned well back from the rail for safety, and there's never been any reason to move them forward." She turned to study the second pricket stand, the one that had remained in its original position. Unlike its fatal companion, this one bore all the signs of normal church use: a thin coating of dust, candle wax from previous ceremonies, and the general appearance of an object that had remained undisturbed for some time. But the fatal pricket told a very different story. Not only had its spike been sharpened and its base moved forward, but Miss Marple now observed that it bore signs of recent handling. The brass showed fresh fingerprints, and there were clean streaks where someone had gripped it during movement. "Inspector Slack," she called politely, "might I draw your attention to something rather significant?" The inspector approached with evident reluctance, clearly hoping that Miss Marple's observations would not further complicate what he preferred to consider a straightforward accident. "This pricket was unlit during tonight's ceremony," she began. "Yet poor Mr. Rowe's jacket shows a distinct smudge of soot low on the back, as if a lighted taper had brushed against him shortly before his fall." She gestured toward the mark on the dead man's clothing. The position of the suiting suggests that someone passed behind Mr. Rowe with a lighted candle or taper quite low down during the period of darkness. Inspector Slack frowned. "But why would anyone be moving about with a light during the moment of silence?" "An excellent question, Inspector, unless perhaps someone needed to test the positioning of their trap in the darkness to ensure that their victim would fall precisely where intended." The implications of her words sent a visible shudder through the assembled group. The idea that someone had been moving stealthily through the darkened church, preparing for murder while the rest of them observed their solemn vigil, was almost too horrifying to contemplate. Mr. Keene, who had been standing near his decorator's tray, looking increasingly uncomfortable, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Marple, I must protest these insinuations. I've explained my activities this afternoon, and I resent any suggestion that—" "Oh, but Mr. Keene," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "I haven't made any specific insinuations. I've simply been observing the evidence that presents itself." She paused, her blue eyes meeting his with that direct gaze that seemed to see through all pretense. "Though I must say your tool collection is most comprehensive." She gestured toward his decorator's tray. "A brass file for sharpening metal, polish for cleaning brass surfaces, white sash cord of exactly the type we discovered under the runner, and She leaned forward slightly. "Unless I'm very much mistaken, a pocket knife with a rather distinctive notch in the blade." Mr. Keen's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, then stopped as he realized the gesture only confirmed her observation. The cut end of Mrs. Pritchard's ribbon shows a very clean slice, the sort that would be made by a sharp blade with a small imperfection. Miss Marple's voice remained pleasantly conversational, as if she were discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "I believe if we were to compare that cut with the edge of your knife, we might find a most interesting correspondence." The church fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the gentle flickering of the peace candle and the distant sound of wind moving through the ancient stonework. All eyes turned to Mr. Keen, whose face had grown ashen under the weight of accumulating evidence. Chapter 7. 2 Lists. 1 Hand. The uncomfortable silence that had settled over St. Michael's following Miss Marple's observations about Mr. Keen's knife was broken by the rustling of papers from the petition table, where Miss Edna Vale had been organizing the Peace League's documents. The librarian, who had remained quietly horrified throughout the evening's revelations, seemed to gather her courage as she approached the group with several sheets of paper clutched in her ink-stained hands. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion about Mr. Rowe's concerns regarding the League's financial matters. I have here the subscription list for the Peace Fund that he was reviewing earlier today, and I thought perhaps—" Her voice trailed off uncertainly. Miss Marple accepted the papers with gracious interest. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Vale. I'm sure these documents will prove most illuminating." The first sheet was indeed the subscription list, bearing the neat typing that characterized all of Miss Vale's volunteer work. The names of St. Mary Mead's residents were arranged in alphabetical order, each followed by their pledged contribution to the Peace League's activities. But as Miss Marple examined the document more closely, she noticed something that made her pause. "Most curious," she murmured, studying 2 entries where the original typed amounts had been carefully overwritten in a different hand. The alterations were skillfully done, clearly the work of someone accustomed to handling financial records, but they were nonetheless apparent to an observant eye. Lady Bantry leaned closer to examine the alterations. "Jane, those changes appear to have been made recently. The ink is slightly different in color." "Precisely, my dear, and the handwriting, while attempting to match the overall character of the document, shows the distinctive flourishes of someone who regularly handles accounts and ledgers." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward where Mr. Rowe's body lay. Poor Mr. Rowe, as treasurer, would certainly have noticed such alterations when he reviewed the list in preparation for tonight's meeting. Miss Vale shifted nervously. "I'm afraid there's another document that might be relevant, Miss Marple. Mr. Keen asked me to type up a list of expenses for the hall repairs project that he's been overseeing. I completed it only yesterday." She handed over a second sheet, and Miss Marple's experienced eye immediately noted several interesting features. Like the subscription list, it bore Miss Vale's characteristic typing, but unlike her usual meticulous work, this document contained what appeared to be a pasted addition, a voucher dated the previous day that had been affixed over what must have been the original entry. More tellingly still, the ribbon used to type this particular voucher was noticeably different in color from the rest of the document, suggesting it had been prepared on a different machine or with different materials than Miss Vale typically employed. "Miss Vale?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Did you prepare this voucher yourself, or was it provided to you already completed?" The librarian's face flushed slightly. "Well, actually, Miss Marple, Mr. Keen brought that particular item to me already typed. He said there had been an error in his original figures, and asked me to paste the correction over the mistake. I thought it rather unusual, as he's normally so precise with such matters, but I didn't like to question the church warden's judgment." Inspector Slack, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, stepped forward. May I examine those documents, Miss Marple? She handed them over willingly. I believe you'll find them most revealing, Inspector. It appears that someone has been making alterations to financial records, presumably to conceal discrepancies that Mr. Rowe had discovered or was about to discover. Mrs. Pritchard, who had been standing nearby in shocked silence, suddenly spoke up. Oh my goodness, Miss Marple, this explains what poor Alden meant when he spoke to me this afternoon. He said he'd found some puzzling inconsistencies in the accounts and wanted to discuss them with the committee tonight. He was quite concerned about maintaining complete transparency in our financial dealings. She wrung her hands anxiously. He mentioned something about a reckoning that needed to take place, and how important it was that everything be brought into the open, for the sake of peace, as he put it. I thought he was simply being his usual conscientious self, but now I realize he must have discovered something quite serious. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Mrs. Pritchard, and I suspect that someone else was equally aware of Mr. Rowe's discoveries and the uncomfortable revelations that tonight's meeting might bring. She turned to address the group with a characteristic gentle authority. You see, in my experience of village life, financial irregularities are often the source of the most desperate actions. People will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid exposure of what they consider minor adjustments or temporary borrowings, particularly when their reputation and standing in the community are at stake. Her gaze moved meaningfully toward Mr. Keene, whose face had grown increasingly pale as the documents were examined. The fear of disgrace, of being branded a thief or embezzler before one's neighbors and fellow parishioners, can drive ordinarily decent people to contemplate the most desperate measures. Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly completing his preliminary medical report, looked up with professional interest. Miss Marple, are you suggesting that this tragedy was motivated by nothing more than bookkeeping discrepancies? I'm suggesting, Doctor, that what appears to be mere bookkeeping to some might represent catastrophic exposure to others. Miss Marple's voice carried the weight of long observation of human nature. A church warden who's been borrowing from church funds, even with the intention of eventual replacement, faces not only legal consequences, but social ruin in a close-knit community like ours. She gestured toward the altered documents. The subscription list shows inflated contributions that would mask the diversion of actual donations. The hall repair expenses appear to include items that may never have been purchased or payments that were never made. Together, they suggest a pattern of financial manipulation that Mr. Rowe was clearly beginning to uncover. Inspector Slack had been examining the papers with growing skepticism about his accident theory. These alterations certainly suggest deliberate deception, he admitted reluctantly. But even if someone was embezzling church funds, that doesn't prove they would resort to murder. Perhaps not in isolation, Inspector. But when combined with the elaborate physical preparations we've discovered, the sharpened pricket, the carefully positioned trap, the waxed cord, and strategic placement of furniture, it suggests someone who was desperate enough to commit murder rather than face exposure. Miss Marple's tone remained pleasantly conversational, as if discussing a mildly interesting puzzle rather than a capital crime. She looked directly at Mr. Keene, whose silence had become increasingly significant. Someone who had intimate knowledge of the church layout, access to all the necessary tools and materials, and the authority to move furniture and make alterations without arousing suspicion. Someone who knew exactly where each participant would be positioned during the ceremony, and who could manipulate the trap from the south door during the moment of silence. The accumulation of evidence, both physical and documentary, had created an atmosphere of inexorable conclusion. Even Inspector Slack could no longer maintain his preference for accident over design, and the assembled parishioners watched with horrified fascination as the web of guilt tightened around the man they had trusted. With their church's care, Mr. Keene stood motionless beside his decorator's tray, surrounded by the tools that had served not only to maintain St. Michael's beauty, but to plan and execute a cold-blooded murder. His shoulders had begun to sag under the weight of revelation, and his face bore the expression of a man who sees his carefully constructed deceptions crumbling beyond any hope of repair. Chapter 8. The Church Warden's Keys. The documentary evidence that Miss Vale had provided seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken accusation, but Miss Marple was not yet finished with her methodical examination of the case. Her attention had been drawn to a detail that she felt required clarification before any final conclusions could be reached. "Mr. Keene," she said with her customary politeness, "as church warden, I believe you hold the keys to all areas of the church, including the sacristy and storage rooms where various items are kept." The church warden's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a hoarse quality that had not been present earlier in the evening. "Yes, Miss Marple, the church warden traditionally maintains access to all church property and facilities. It's a position of considerable trust." "Indeed it is," she agreed pleasantly. "And it was in your capacity as keeper of these keys that you retrieved the pricket stands this afternoon for tonight's ceremony." "The stands are normally stored in the vestry when not in use," Keene replied, his words coming slowly as if each one required careful consideration. "I brought them out and positioned them for what I thought would create a more atmospheric setting for the peace vigil." Inspector Slack looked up from his examination of the altered financial documents. "And you admit to adjusting the runner in the south aisle as well?" "Certainly, I noticed it was lying unevenly, and I didn't want anyone to stumble in the dim lighting. Ensuring the safety of parishioners is part of my responsibilities." Keene's response sounded rehearsed, as if he had been preparing these explanations throughout the evening. Miss Marple approached his decorator's tray with renewed interest, her sharp eyes cataloging its contents with the thoroughness of a natural historian studying specimens. "What a remarkably complete collection of tools you maintain, Mr. Keene. Most comprehensive for church maintenance work." The tray contained far more than simple cleaning supplies. In addition to the brass file and metal polish they had already noted, there was a coil of white sash cord that appeared identical to the piece they had discovered beneath the runner. A sharp pocket knife lay beside various cleaning cloths, its blade showing that distinctive small notch that Miss Marple had observed earlier. "The sash cord is quite new," she observed, lifting a section to examine its texture. "Recently purchased, I should say, and prepared with the same beeswax treatment we found on the piece hidden under the fabric." Keene's face had grown increasingly ashen, but he managed to reply, "I often need various materials for church repairs. Cord is useful for many maintenance tasks." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, "though this particular cord appears to have been waxed specifically to reduce friction, rather like the preparation one might give to a rope or line that needed to move smoothly and silently across fabric and wood." Lady Bantry, who had been watching this exchange with growing fascination, suddenly pointed toward Keene's left cuff. "Jane, look at his sleeve." Miss Marple followed her friend's gaze and observed what Lady Bantry had noticed: a faint golden smear on the fabric of Keene's jacket, precisely the color and consistency of beeswax. The stain was small but unmistakable, catching the electric light with that characteristic waxy gleam they had learned to recognize. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "That appears to be beeswax on your cuff, Mr. Keene. Rather curious, since the church uses only paraffin candles in its regular services." Keene glanced down at his sleeve with an expression of trapped dismay. I may have brushed against Mrs. Pritchard's candle while arranging things earlier. But Mrs. Pritchard has been most careful not to handle her candle directly this evening," Miss Marple observed gently. "She's been tending it from a distance to avoid disturbing the wick or the beautiful ribbon. I watched her quite specifically because I admired her careful attention to such a meaningful piece." She paused, allowing the implications of this observation to settle. Moreover, that particular stain appears to be on the inside of your cuff, the sort of mark one gets from handling waxy materials directly, rather than from casual contact with a burning candle. Dr. Haydock had completed his preliminary medical examination and approached the group with his professional bag in hand. Miss Marple, I have been listening to your observations with great interest. The physical evidence you've uncovered certainly suggests elaborate preparation rather than accidental death. Indeed, Doctor, and such preparation would have required not only considerable planning, but access to specific materials and tools. Miss Marple gestured toward the decorator's tray. Someone with the church warden's keys would have had unrestricted access to the church throughout the afternoon, allowing ample time to position the pricket stands, file the spike to sharpness, arrange the cord beneath the runner, and prepare all the other elements of this elaborate trap. Inspector Slack had been examining the knife from Keen's tray, comparing its blade to the clean cut on Mrs. Pritchard's ribbon. This notch in the blade matches perfectly with the cut pattern on the fabric, he announced grimly. There's no question that this particular knife was used to sever the ribbon. Mrs. Pritchard looked bewildered. But why would anyone want to cut my ribbon? It was purely decorative, and it bore such a meaningful message of peace. I believe, Mrs. Pritchard, that the ribbon was cut to provide a small piece of fabric that could be used to silence the movement of metal parts during the preparation of the trap, Miss Marple explained. A few threads of cloth wrapped around the hook of the taper pole, for instance, would prevent any telltale metallic sounds while the cord was being manipulated in the darkness. She turned back to address the group with that air of gentle authority that characterized her approach to such matters. You see, the success of this elaborate plan depended entirely upon silence and darkness. Any unexpected sound during the moment of quiet observance would have alerted the intended victim or other participants to unusual activity. Miss Vale, who had been standing quietly with her ink-stained fingers pressed to her lips in horrified fascination, suddenly spoke up. Miss Marple, there's something else that might be relevant. When Mr. Keen brought me that corrected voucher yesterday, his hands had that same chemical smell I noticed on his tools tonight. The scent of brass polish? Ah, yes. Miss Marple nodded. Brasso has a most distinctive odor, quite different from ordinary wax or cleaning materials, and we did observe traces of metal polish on Mrs. Pritchard's candle ribbon, suggesting it had come into contact with freshly polished brass. She looked directly at Keen, whose silence had become increasingly significant as the evidence mounted. The pattern becomes quite clear when one examines all the elements together. Access through the church warden's keys, tools, and materials readily available, intimate knowledge of church routines and the evening's arrangements, and now the clear motive provided by Mr. Rowe's discovery of financial irregularities. The ancient walls of St. Michael's seemed to echo with the weight of these revelations, as if the stones themselves bore witness to the careful unraveling of a crime that had been planned to appear as nothing more than tragic accident. Even the peace candle seemed to flicker more urgently in its hurricane shade, casting dancing shadows that emphasized the gravity of what had been discovered in this place, meant for worship and contemplation. Mr. Keen stood motionless beside his incriminating collection of tools, his face bearing the expression of a man who had watched his carefully constructed deception collapse, piece by piece under Miss Marple's relentless but gentle examination of the evidence. Chapter 9. Alibis. During the silence. The accumulation of physical evidence had created an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension within St. Michael's, but Miss Marple understood that a complete picture required not only the means and motive for murder, but also the opportunity. Inspector Slack, despite his earlier reluctance to consider anything beyond accident, had begun to appreciate the methodical nature of her investigation. Miss Marple, he said with grudging respect, your observations about the physical evidence are certainly compelling. But for a case of premeditated murder, we need to establish precisely where everyone was positioned during those crucial 2 minutes of silence. "Quite right, Inspector," she replied approvingly. "The success of such an elaborate plan would depend entirely upon the perpetrator being in exactly the right position to manipulate the trap at the crucial moment." She turned to address the assembled group with her characteristic gentle authority. "Perhaps we might reconstruct the scene as it existed during our moment of observance, each person positioned as they were when the silence began." The Reverend Clement, who had been standing in shocked bewilderment throughout these revelations, stepped forward to assist. "I was at the chancel steps, of course, having just concluded the opening prayer. I remained there throughout the 2 minutes facing the congregation." Mrs. Pritchard, still clutching her handkerchief, nodded agreement. "I knelt in the second pew from the front on the north side of the nave. I wanted to keep my peace candle in view to ensure it continued burning properly." Miss Vale spoke up quietly from her position near the petition table. "I remained by the documents in the north aisle in case anyone wished to add their signature to our peace petition after the service." Mr. Jelks, whose professional pride had been wounded by the evening's discoveries, drew himself up with dignity. "I stationed myself near the vestry curtains, as is my custom during special services. One must be vigilant about drafts that might extinguish candles during solemn moments." All eyes turned to Mr. Keene, whose position during the crucial period had not yet been established. The church warden seemed to realize that his response would be critical, and he appeared to gather himself before speaking. "I was at the south door," he said with careful precision, ensuring that any late arrivals could enter without disturbing the ceremony. "It's a responsibility I always take during important services." Miss Marple's blue eyes brightened with interest. "The south door, you say? That would place you in an ideal position to observe the entire congregation, would it not?" "Well, yes, I suppose so," Keene replied cautiously. "And also," she continued pleasantly, "in an excellent position to reach across the chancel screen with something like a taper pole, particularly if one needed to manipulate lines or cords that had been previously positioned beneath the south aisle runner." The implications of her observation sent a visible tremor through the group. Lady Bantry looked toward the south door, measuring the distance with her eyes. "Jane, someone standing there could easily have reached the area where we found the cord." "Precisely, my dear, the chancel screen is not particularly high, and a determined individual with a long implement could certainly manage the necessary reach." Miss Marple paused thoughtfully. "Of course, such manipulation would need to be accomplished in complete silence during a moment when everyone's attention was focused on prayer and remembrance." Inspector Slack had been taking notes throughout this reconstruction. But surely someone would have noticed unusual movement or sound during such a quiet period. "An excellent point, Inspector. Let me ask whether anyone recalls hearing anything unusual during those 2 minutes of silence." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "Now that you mention it," he said, "I did notice what seemed like a small sound, rather like the twang of a tight line or wire under tension. I thought perhaps it was the church settling or some minor noise from the heating system." "Most interesting, Doctor. And when did you hear this sound in relation to the tragedy?" "Just before the clank of metal on stone, I believe. A small twang, then almost immediately the sound of the pricket stand being struck." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "Which would be consistent with a cord or line being drawn tight, causing Mr. Rowe to fall backward, followed immediately by his collision with the sharpened pricket." A young voice suddenly spoke up from the back of the church. Tommy Morrison, the baker's son, had been sitting quietly with his mother throughout the evening's events, but now he raised his hand tentatively. "Please, miss, I heard something too." He demonstrated with a small gesture. "Like a little snap or twang, just like the doctor said. And then there was the big noise. Thank you, Tommy. That's very helpful indeed. Miss Marple's voice carried genuine warmth for the boy's contribution. 2 witnesses to the sound of a line under tension, exactly what one would expect if a cord trap had been sprung at the crucial moment. She turned her attention back to Mr. Keene, whose face had grown increasingly pale as the timeline of events became clearer. From your position at the south door, Mr. Keene, you would have had an unobstructed view of Mr. Rowe throughout the ceremony. You would have known exactly when he was in the correct position for your trap to be effective. I was simply performing my duties as church warden, Keene stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Of course, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Though I noticed that your right cuff, in addition to the beeswax stain we observed earlier, also shows what appears to be a small amount of golden wax near the seam, the sort of residue one might acquire from handling a waxed cord under some tension. Lady Bantry leaned closer to examine the evidence Miss Marple had identified. Yes, Jane, I can see it quite clearly now that you've pointed it out. Those golden particles are definitely beeswax. Inspector Slack had been studying his notes with growing certainty. The positioning, the physical evidence, the motive provided by the financial documents. It all points to deliberate murder rather than accident. Indeed, Inspector, Miss Marple replied. Someone with intimate knowledge of the church and its routines, someone with access to all the necessary tools and materials, someone who knew exactly where each participant would be positioned during the ceremony. She looked directly at Keene, and someone who had compelling reason to prevent Mr. Rowe from making his planned revelations about financial irregularities. The church warden's shoulders sagged as the full weight of the evidence settled upon him. Around him, the parishioners who had trusted him with their beloved church watched in horrified fascination as the extent of his deception became clear. Moreover, Miss Marple continued with gentle relentlessness, the elaborate nature of this crime suggests not a moment of panic or passion, but careful premeditation. The filing of the pricket, the positioning of furniture, the preparation of the waxed cord. All of this required considerable planning and forethought. She paused, her voice taking on a note of genuine sadness. Most tragic of all, this elaborate murder was committed during a ceremony dedicated to peace and reconciliation, using the very symbols of faith and remembrance as instruments of death. The silence that followed her words was broken only by the gentle flickering of the peace candle, its pure flame continuing to burn despite the evil that had been revealed in its light. Chapter 10. Lady Chapel, Line, Pricket, and Peace. Ancient stones of St. Michael's seemed to hold their breath as Miss Marple moved toward the Lady Chapel rail, where the tragic events of the evening had reached their fatal conclusion. The assembled group followed, her with the fascination of those witnessing the final act of a drama they had unwittingly participated in from the very beginning. I believe, she said, with that gentle authority that had become familiar throughout the evening, that we now have sufficient evidence to understand exactly how this dreadful crime was planned and executed. She positioned herself near the chapel rail, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene one final time. The method, while elaborate in its preparation, was actually quite straightforward in its execution. Inspector Slack, his notebook ready, nodded for her to continue. Even he could no longer doubt that they were dealing with premeditated murder rather than tragic accident. Earlier today, our murderer used his position as church warden to make careful preparations. First, he filed one of the pricket spikes to a sharp point using the brass file from his decorator's tray, creating what was essentially a weapon rather than a simple candle holder. Miss Marple gestured toward the fatal stand. The brass dust we discovered under the drip pan. and the fresh file marks on the spike itself provide clear evidence of this preparation. She moved closer to where poor Mr. Rowe still lay in his final position. Next, he moved this pricket forward from its customary position. As Mr. Jelks has confirmed, the stands are normally kept 3 paces back from the chapel rail for safety. But for this trap to be effective, the sharpened spike needed to be positioned exactly where a falling man would encounter it. Lady Bantry shuddered at the cold calculation this represented. The precision required Jane. He must have planned it down to the very inch. Indeed, my dear. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the plan was the method used to cause Mr. Rowe to fall backward at precisely the right moment. Miss Marple walked slowly along the south aisle runner. A loop of sash cord, smoothed with beeswax to ensure silent movement, was positioned around Mr. Rowe's ankles as he took his place for the ceremony. The trailing ends of this cord were then fed under the runner, leading back toward the chancel screen where someone at the south door could reach them. She paused at the spot where they had discovered the hidden cord. The beeswax trail we found along this runner, and the grooves in the fabric where the lines were repeatedly tested, show us exactly how this trap was prepared. The golden crumbs came from the wax used to lubricate the cord, ensuring it would move smoothly and silently when the moment came. Dr. Haydock looked puzzled. But Miss Marple, how could such a cord be positioned around someone's ankles without their knowledge? An excellent question, Doctor. I believe the answer lies in Mr. Keen's admitted activity of adjusting the runner in this aisle. Under the pretense of straightening the fabric to prevent people from stumbling, he had the perfect opportunity to position his prepared cord exactly where Mr. Rowe would step when taking his place for the ceremony. She gestured toward the pew spindle that bore the waxy residue. The cord passed around this wooden support at ankle height, creating a snare that would be invisible in the dim lighting, but entirely effective when tension was applied. Inspector Slack was following her reconstruction with professional interest, and the actual triggering of this trap occurred during the 2 minutes of silence. Precisely, Inspector. At the moment when everyone's attention was focused on solemn remembrance, when the slightest sound would carry clearly through the church, our murderer used the taper pole to reach across the chancel screen and draw tight the hidden cords. Miss Marple's voice carried a note of distaste for the cold-blooded timing. Dr. Haydock and young Tommy Morrison both heard the telltale sound, the twang of a line under sudden tension. She looked toward the chancel screen where the taper pole still leaned. The chalk mark on the wooden shaft shows us where this pole rested against the pew end to provide leverage. The clean hook, despite appearing unused, bears microscopic fibers from the cord it was used to manipulate. Mrs. Pritchard, who had been listening with growing horror, suddenly gasped. Miss Marple, that means someone was moving about in the darkness while we were all praying. Someone was preparing to commit murder during our moment of peace. I'm afraid so, Mrs. Pritchard. And the soot mark on Mr. Rowe's jacket tells us that our murderer even tested his preparation with a lighted taper, passing it behind the intended victim to ensure the positioning was exact. Miss Marple's tone carried genuine sadness at such calculation. Nothing was left to chance. She turned to address Mr. Keen directly, who had remained silent throughout her reconstruction. The evidence against you is quite overwhelming, I'm afraid. The filed pricket from your tools, the waxed cord matching your supplies, the brass polish residue on Mrs. Pritchard's candle ribbon from your cleaning activities, the knife with its distinctive notch that cut that very ribbon, and most damning of all, the beeswax on your cuff from handling the prepared cord. Keen's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. How did you know to look for all these things? In my experience, Mr. Keen, elaborate deceptions often reveal themselves through the very complexity that their creators believe makes them undetectable. Miss Marple's reply was gentle but inexorable. You had access to everything necessary for this crime, the keys to all areas of the church, the tools and materials, the knowledge of where everyone would be positioned during the ceremony, and the opportunity to make your preparations without suspicion. She paused, her expression growing even more sorrowful. But perhaps most significantly, you had a compelling motive to prevent Mr. Rowe from making his planned revelations about financial irregularities in the Peace League's accounts. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The altered subscription lists and the suspicious repair expenses certainly suggest embezzlement of church funds. Indeed. Inspector, the fear of exposure, of being branded a thief before his fellow parishioners, drove Mr. Keene to contemplate murder rather than face the consequences of his actions. Miss Marple looked directly at the church warden. Poor Mr. Rowe had discovered your adjustments to the accounts and intended to bring them into the open tonight, for the sake of peace, as he told Mrs. Pritchard. Mr. Keene's shoulders finally sagged completely under the weight of accumulated evidence and accusation. He would have ruined me, he said hoarsely, over a few pounds that I fully intended to replace. The hall repairs were more expensive than we'd budgeted, and I simply borrowed from other funds temporarily. But it wasn't temporary anymore, was it, Mr. Keene? Miss Marple's voice carried infinite compassion, even as it delivered the final blow. The amounts had grown larger than you could easily replace, and Mr. Rowe's meticulous review of the books would have exposed everything. Inspector Slack stepped forward with grim authority. Lionel Keene, I am arresting you for the murder of Alden Rowe. As the formal words of arrest were spoken, the peace candle continued to burn in its hurricane shade, its pure flame unmarked by the evil that had been revealed in its light. Mrs. Pritchard looked toward it with tears in her eyes. Peace, she whispered, and such a terrible price for it. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. Peace is indeed a precious word, my dear Mrs. Pritchard, but when people attempt to arrange it through deception and violence, they destroy the very thing they claim to seek. She looked once more at the Lady Chapel, where the evidence of careful planning and cold-blooded execution would forever mark this place of worship. True peace, I believe, can only come through truth and reconciliation, never through lies and murder, no matter how desperate the circumstances. The ancient walls of St. Michael's bore silent witness as justice finally claimed its due in this place that should have known only prayers and peace.